Hey guys, welcome back to another video on the channel. Today I'll be discussing the new AFL 2023 fixture that recently just came out, and I'll be going through all the games that are currently been scheduled. So yeah, we'll get straight into it. Round one, of course, we've already seen. You got Richmond Carlton opening this off for the season at the MCG. Then you got Geelong Collingwood, which should be a good game. Then on the Saturday you got North Melbourne West Coast, Port Adelaide Brisbane, Gold Coast Sydney, and then Melbourne versus the Western Bulldogs, the grand final rematch from 2021, as the Channel 7 game. And you also get Brisbane versus GWS, which should be a pretty dead game. Hawthorn versus Essendon, so Brad Scott against his former Brad Scott kicking off the season against Hawthorn, arch rivals, should be a good game. And Fremantle versus the Saints to kick off to end off round one. Round two is Carlton versus Geelong opening on the Thursday. Should be a pretty good game, that one. Then you got Brisbane versus Melbourne on the Friday. And then on the Saturday, you got Collingwood versus Port Adelaide, Adelaide versus Richmond, Fremantle versus North Melbourne, and Western Bulldogs and St Kilda, which I believe is the Channel 7 game. Should be alright. Then you got Sydney Hawthorn, West Coast GWS as an interesting scheduled game there. And Essendon versus Gold Coast, which you'd think would be the Channel 7 game. Round 3, Western Bulldogs having a home game against the Brisbane Lions. Another prime time match for the Western Bulldogs. Then this should be a really, really interesting game. Collingwood versus Richmond at the MCG. That will draw in a big crowd, that one. Hawthorn versus North Melbourne. Clarko against his former team. Should be very, very interesting. Maybe a game that they could even win, to be honest. Then you got Carlton GWS. Port Adelaide versus Adelaide. You got the showdown. And then St Kilda at the Essendon at the MCG. A St Kilda home game, which means it's the first time it's been played there since 2006 for the Saints' 150th anniversary. Should be an interesting game. And then you got Gold Coast versus Geelong, Fremantle versus West Coast, which is the derby, and in my opinion, quite early to be scheduling a derby. But yeah, nevertheless, it definitely still could work, and you got plenty of games, and yeah, it could work. It could work. Especially seeming it will be interesting for the Dockers. Seeming not all of it might go to plan. So it's going to be interesting. And then you got Melbourne Sydney, of course, to round off the round, which will be the game on TV. Then kicking into round 4, opening the Easter round with Brisbane versus the Western Bulldogs. Of course, they always seem to open up. And then a very, very interesting change-up. The Good Friday match is not North Melbourne versus Carlton anymore. It still is North Melbourne, but they are going to be playing Carlton, which is very interesting. I may would have preferred a Carlton versus Western Bulldogs, but doesn't really matter. Then you got Adelaide versus Fremantle. You got Richmond versus the Western Bulldogs, which is a very interesting schedule game. Got Sydney versus Port Adelaide, which will probably be, I think, the Channel 7 game, and St Kilda versus Gold Coast at Marvel. It could be any of the two, really. I probably would prefer St Kilda to be playing a different team than Gold Coast if it was a TV game, but that's just my opinion. It'll probably be Sydney versus Port Adelaide anyway. And then on the then you got a bit of an interesting game. You got Essendon taking on GWS, West Coast versus Melbourne, and then the Easter Monday game, which is Geelong versus Hawthorn. Hopefully, I'll be in a better mood to watch it this next season. Seeming I didn't watch it this season. It was like the only game I didn't watch. That was a TV game. Anyway, into the Magic Round. You got Adelaide versus Carlton. Should be a very, very interesting game, that one. Good to see Adelaide getting a primetime game. Then you got Fremantle versus Gold Coast. Sydney versus Richmond. Interesting one, that one. Then you got North Melbourne versus Brisbane. Essendon versus Melbourne, which is a very, very interesting game to be scheduled at that time. Not a fan, but anyways. You got Port Adelaide versus Western Bulldogs, another primetime match for the Doggies. Geelong versus West Coast. Hawthorn versus GWS, which is a very, very interesting scheduled Channel 7 matchup. I'm probably not going to watch it. Much rather prefer my side taking on the Saints at Adelaide Oval to finish off the Magic Round. Then round 6, you got Fremantle versus the Western Bulldogs. Very interesting primetime game. Another one for the Western Bulldogs. The Dockers do deserve it though after coming back from that final last season. Should be a good game. You got Port Adelaide versus West Coast, which in my opinion will be one of the worst games of the season. That one. GWS versus Brisbane Lions and Geelong versus Sydney, the grand final rematch on the Saturday. Should be interesting at GMBA. Interesting schedule. Seeming the ground's going to be under heaps of construction. You got Hawthorn versus Adelaide, Carlton versus St Kilda. It should be a pretty good game. Gold Coast versus North Melbourne. And then on the Anzac Day Eve, you got Melbourne versus Richmond and Collingwood versus Essendon to round off Anzac Day round. And round 7, interesting primetime match for the Saints taking on the Power at Marvel. Don't really remember the last time they took on the Power at Marvel. But anyways, you got Brisbane versus Fremantle, which should be a pretty good game. Interesting that is being scheduled at 1:45 at the Gabba. I much would have preferred that to be the Channel 7 game. But anyways, you got Sydney versus GWS, which is of course the Sydney derby. You got the Western Bulldogs taking on Hawthorn. West Coast versus Carlton, which is going to be a bit of a dead game. And Melbourne versus North Melbourne is going to be scheduled as the Channel 7 primetime game. That is interesting. I would have much preferred, to swap that around with Brisbane Fremantle. But anyways, that's what the AFL have gone and done. And then you got Essendon versus Geelong, which should be a pretty interesting game, that one. Which is, of course, I forgot what it's called. Anyway, you got Richmond versus Gold Coast. That'll be an interesting Channel 7 game. And then you got Adelaide versus Collingwood to finish off the round. Oh, the country match. That's what it's called. For Essendon Geelong. I had a bit of a mind blank there. Then you got Carlton versus Brisbane. Another primetime match for Carlton. That one's going to be an interesting one, that one. Richmond versus West Coast. Geelong versus Adelaide. Then you got Gold Coast versus Melbourne, which should be an interesting game. Fremantle versus Hawthorn. And GWS versus the Western Bulldogs at Manuka Oval. Then, on the Sunday, you got Port Adelaide versus Essendon. Collingwood versus Sydney should be a great game for Channel 7, and North Melbourne versus St Kilda. Then kicking into round 9, got a double header Friday. Boy, do I hate those. Anyway, you got West Coast versus Gold Coast. Doesn't really matter. No one's going to watch that. And then you got Richmond versus Geelong. Going to be a very, very interesting game, that one. And then you got Sydney, Freo, North Melbourne, Port Adelaide, Hawthorn, Melbourne, and Channel 7 primetime match between the Bombers and the Lions. Should be quite interesting. Then you got Carlton versus the Western Bulldogs, and which could actually be the Channel 7 game. Who knows? I don't think so, though. Then on the Sunday, which is Mother's Day, you got Adelaide versus St Kilda and Collingwood versus GWS. Now, kicking into round 10, Anzac Day round. Not Anzac Day round, Indigenous round, sorry. Port Adelaide versus Melbourne will be opening as a primetime match. North Melbourne versus Sydney, Western Bulldogs versus Adelaide, Fremantle versus Geelong, Brisbane versus Gold Coast, interesting Q clash. And then you've got Essendon and Richmond, which is, of course, the Dreamtime at the J match. Then you've got Hawthorn West Coast, Carlton Collingwood. Going to be an interesting game, that one. And GWS St Kilda at Giant Stadium. Then you got Sydney versus Carlton, another primetime match for the Blues. St Kilda versus Hawthorn. Melbourne versus Fremantle, that one will be interesting. Geelong versus GWS. West Coast Essendon. And then you got Gold Coast versus Western Bulldogs as a primetime match at TIO, which should be quite a fun game to watch, I reckon. Then you got Richmond versus Port Adelaide. Collingwood versus North Melbourne, which is scheduled as the Channel 7 match. That's going to be utter stupid, but it's my team anyway, so I'll watch it. And Adelaide versus Brisbane to kick off the end of the round. Then you got Melbourne versus Carlton. Another primetime match for the Blues. Port Adelaide versus Hawthorn. West Coast versus Collingwood. Hopefully we can beat West Coast next season. Gold Coast versus Adelaide. Interesting match at TAO. Almost nearly more interesting and more appealing than the Channel 7 primetime match, which will be Western Bulldogs taking on Geelong at Marvel, you'd think. And on the Sunday, you got GWS and Richmond, which is going to be a bit of a dead game, and the Bombers and the Roos, so pretty dead games for the Sunday. And then moving on to round 13, I think this is another bye round. The second of the bye rounds. You got Sydney versus St Kilda as a primetime match on the first day. Then another primetime match, Western Bulldogs versus Port Adelaide. Then Hawthorn taking on the Lions. Adelaide versus West Coast, and Fremantle versus Richmond, scheduled as a juicy, very, very juicy Saturday primetime match. North Melbourne versus GWS and Carlton Essendon. That's a very, very interesting scheduled match as a primetime Sunday match. And Melbourne versus Collingwood, which actually are meeting 6 rounds before this, which is quite interesting. Only 6 rounds after. Not a long time for the Queen's Birthday clash. Then you got Port Adelaide versus Geelong as the prime time match. Brisbane versus Geelong as well, also getting rewarded with a prime time match. The Giants and the Dockers. Richmond versus St Kilda, that'll be an interesting match. Carlton Gold Coast and North Melbourne versus the Western Bulldogs to end off round 14. Round 15, we see the Cats with their brand new stadium getting rewarded with a primetime match against the D's. You also got St Kilda getting a primetime match against the Lions. That one's going to be interesting. Sydney versus West Coast. Fremantle versus Essendon. Very, very interesting scheduled primetime match. And then you got Collingwood versus Adelaide and Gold Coast and Hawthorn to finish off the bye rounds. Then round 16. This is where the fixtures get a little bit weird, where only the times haven't been announced or the days, just the stadium and who's playing who. You got Western Bulldogs versus Freo, St Kilda versus West Coast, Sydney Geelong, Melbourne GWS, Hawthorn Carlton, Gold Coast Collingwood, Essendon Port Adelaide, Brisbane Richmond, and Adelaide North Melbourne. So a few interesting games in that round, specifically Sydney versus Geelong, the grand final rematch, and Brisbane Richmond. Then in round 17, should be another interesting round. You got Western Bulldogs Collingwood, St Kilda Melbourne, Richmond Sydney, Port Adelaide Gold Coast, GWS Hawthorn, Geelong North Melbourne, Freo Carlton, Essendon Adelaide, and Brisbane versus West Coast. So not a big round, that one. Round 18, West Coast versus Richmond. Sydney Bulldogs, that'll be a good one. North Melbourne Hawthorn, Melbourne Brisbane, that'll also be interesting. Gold Coast St Kilda, Geelong Essendon for another country match. Collingwood Freo, Carlton Port Adelaide, and Adelaide GWS. Then round 19, got St Kilda versus North Melbourne, Richmond Hawthorn, Port Adelaide Collingwood, Melbourne Adelaide, Freo Sydney, that'll be good. GWS Gold Coast, Essendon Western Bulldogs, Carlton West Coast, and Brisbane taking on the Geelong Cats, that'll be good. That game. And round 20, You got Western Bulldogs Giants, West Coast North, they'll be shit. Hawthorn St Kilda, Richmond Melbourne, as a bit of a rematch from earlier on in the season. Gold Coast Brisbane, another Q clash. Geelong Freo, they'll be good. Collingwood Carlton, they'll also be good. Essendon Sydney, they'll be also good. And Adelaide Port Adelaide, another good game and a showdown. What a good round that's going to be. Lots of good rounds, lots of good games scheduled for that round. Quite looking forward to it. Round 21, Western Bulldogs versus Richmond, St Kilda Carlton, Hawthorn Collingwood, North Melbourne that'll be a bad one at Bloodstone. Giants Sydney as a derby, Geelong Port Adelaide, Fremantle Brisbane, they'll be good. Essendon West Coast and Adelaide taking on the Suns to finish off round 21. Round 22, you got Freo taking on West Coast in the derby, the Swans taking on the Suns, St Kilda versus Richmond, Port Adelaide versus Giants, that'll be a bit of a dead game. North Melbourne versus Essendon, Hawthorn Western Bulldogs, Collingwood Geelong, that'll be a good game. Brisbane Adelaide and Carlton Melbourne, interesting round that one. Then moving on to the second last round of the season, round 23, you got St Kilda Geelong, Richmond North Melbourne, Western Bulldogs West Coast, Melbourne Hawthorn, GWS Essendon, Gold Coast Carlton, Collingwood Brisbane, they'll be good. Freo Port and Adelaide versus Sydney. Final round of the season, obviously got the extra round, round 24. You got West Coast versus Adelaide, Sydney Melbourne, Port Adelaide Richmond, North Melbourne Gold Coast, Hawthorn Fremantle, Geelong versus Western Bulldogs, that'll be good. Essendon Collingwood, bit of a life or death match. Carlton GWS and Brisbane versus St Kilda. And yeah, that's pretty much the round. Pretty sure every single team plays each other twice with 23 games, I think, played for each team, I'm pretty sure. But anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. And yeah, stay tuned for some more videos on the channel.